A massive media debate in the UK has sprung up around the BBC and a proposal to scrap the compulsory licence fee that's funded the public broadcaster there for decades and replace it with an opt-in subscription model. This reportedly would force the BBC to drastically reduce the number of television and radio stations it runs. And guess what? In a survey last week, more than half the respondents agreed with abolishing the licence fee, while 63% agreed the BBC was an important part of British culture, 50% believed it didn't represent value for money, and only 29% reckoned it did. Sure enough, the BBC reacted strongly, its chairman, Sir David Clementi, saying the plan would weaken the nation. And just as predictably, the activists are out in force too, with a petition to save the public broadcaster, calling on Prime Minister Boris Johnson to stop this war on our BBC and this thinly veiled attempt to dodge accountability. Look, of course the Beeb's an important part of British culture, but plenty accuse it of losing touch with the mainstream as it obsesses with minority activism, like earlier this month when it featured a poem by Gray Crosby on, quote, the struggles of getting a haircut as a non-binary person.
We're queer and we're here, and life can be tough out there. So do you have to make a fuss, or could you just cut our here?
Just one example of how the BBC staff of 22,000 spend nearly £5 billion a year. Not everyone thinks it's beyond a trim.
I'm a huge fan of the BBC in many ways, but I think that what it suffers from is it's obsessed with diversity, but it really struggles with diversity of opinion. Most of the people who populate the BBC, who work there, tend to subscribe to a particular
Metropolitan Liberals.
Not super left-wing, but it is a particular worldview, and I think it's particularly bad at articulating a conservative point of view.
Former BBC presenters have been standing in its corner.
The BBC is deeply loved. If this planet survives, it will be due to two words: David Attenborough. And David Attenborough spent his career...
And there are programmes that no other channel could afford to make apart from the BBC.
So if the planet survives climate change and global warming, it's thanks to Sir David Attenborough and the BBC. Now, I love an Attenborough doco as much as anyone, but having watched many of them, I think they'd have one of the highest carbon footprints of any television series ever. I know their point, but give me a break. The world is hardly light on for alarmist takes on global warming. Here's a former BBC presenter who's a little more in touch.
News Night had a debate between three different people on BBC Two last night about this, and didn't manage to find a single person who thought the licence fee should go, but perhaps again proving how out of touch they are with the public, who it appears have fallen out of love with the BBC licence fee.
All these arguments sound terribly familiar in Australia, don't they? Well, so does this diagnosis.
The fact we are even having this discussion about the BBC is the fault of the BBC itself, which has proven itself to be untrustworthy and lacking in political impartiality in recent years. The BBC disgraced itself over its coverage of Brexit. It proved it was no longer in touch with the vast swaths of the country. It also proved itself remarkably out of touch for failing to predict the biggest story of the most recent election, Boris Johnson's historic toppling of Labour's Northern Red Wall.
Yep, focusing on its own niche issues, out of touch with mainstream concerns, suffering groupthink, lacking a diversity of ideas and getting the big issues wrong. That's their BBC, and it sounds very much like our ABC.